Welcome back, everyone, to the Vibrant Flow podcast. And today I am being treated with a special guest, Dr. Jason Lepojärvi, who is a Finnish-Canadian doctor of love. And these topics that we're going to dive into are nuanced and they're really deep, and that's what I'm here for. So Dr. Jason Lepojärvi is currently based in Oregon, and he is the former president of the Oxford University C.S. Lewis Society. Is that correct? Did I get that
That's
right?
correct, yeah.
Yes. A tutor on the works of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Inklings, and a frequent lecturer on the topics involving C.S. Lewis' theology of love. His research has been published broadly in journals, including Harvard Theological Review, the Journal of Inklings Studies, and Religious Studies. Right. And so your current position is the C.S. Lewis Associate Professor of Theology and Literature at George Fox University in Oregon. And as I understand, this is a recent development in your professional life. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Johan. I'm looking forward to the discussion. We moved to the US less than a year ago after having spent 6 years in Canada and 4 years in England before that.
Right.
And the position I now have is a dream job, and I'm never going to leave unless they fire me.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, that is absolutely what we're here for, to do what we're called to do and to be passionate about what we do. You're also a love researcher, if you could say it like that. In Finnish, you would say rakkaustutkija, right? But love researcher into the topic of love, the experience of love, the concept of love. You've written books on love and sex, marriage, and you've also participated in the Finnish version of Married at First Sight. Isn't that the English version? Yes, Married at First Sight, that TV program.
It is.
As an expert in the show, the TV show. So I'm really looking forward to diving into topics related to friendship between the sexes, the different types of love that there are, marriage, and your 30 theses on love and why there are 30 of those. I'm really curious to know. But let's jump right into the topic of friendship and philia as the Greek word for the love that is characteristic of friendship. Why is this interesting to you in the first place? Why should we talk
love
about
in general?
Friendship.
Or friendship?
Yeah, friendship. Philia is a type of love.
Well, I'm fascinated about all forms and types of love and elements of love and disagreements about love. Because and friendship is one of them, or at least some say that it's one of them. First and foremost, my mentor, one of my mentors, C.S. Lewis, in 1960, he wrote this famous book called The Four Loves, in which he distinguished 4 types of love, and friendship was one of them. And in the book, he says that not many English speakers think of it as a love, but for example, in the Greek language, the word for philia, it means friendship and it means love in equal measure. So when you hear philia, you think of love, a real love, and you think of friendship,
right?
And that's not always the case in English, or in many other languages like Finnish, ystävyys. It's a value, but you necessarily don't think of it primarily in terms of love.
Yeah, you don't. That's true. That is true. So when you've studied C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and by the way, if you, my dear listeners, if you don't know who these 2 guys are, I don't know where you've spent your entire life, but I assume that you are going to do your due diligence and at least Google those names if you are not aware. But I am assuming that most of my listeners do know who C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien are, especially because I'm a huge fan of both. And I know that many of you are as well. But Jason, when you've studied Lewis and Tolkien, you've noticed that this certainly is a discernible relationship from others. And in the book, The Four Loves, how does Lewis describe philia, friendship?
Yeah, I think you're right. They do think it's a love, one of the greatest loves. And those of you who don't know, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien belong to this very influential circle of Oxford-based authors and intellectuals and churchmen and medicine men. There was a medical doctor among them who met regularly to drink beer and read out loud what they've been writing lately. And this friendship this collaboration produced some of the greatest 20th century literature, like The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia and dozens of other books as well. Tolkien and Lewis, they were pioneers in many ways in resurrecting this love, also in experimenting and being representative of this first generation who befriended the opposite sex. And we can talk about friendship between the sexes later. But in many ways, they are pioneers. In The Four Loves, in this book that I showed you, the common denominator of all kinds of love, whether we're talking about Eros or affection or friendship or whatnot, so what all love types share in common is that love is an affectionate and a responsive commitment to the beloved's flourishing.
Right.
An affectionate and a responsive commitment to the beloved's flourishing, where the beloved can be anyone or anything. And so that's the common denominator. But then Lewis goes on to argue that, well, love doesn't look the same in every relationship, right? Love looks very different in romance as opposed to a mother-daughter relationship. Not hugely different, but distinguishable. So each of these human relationships adds its peculiar character, its uniqueness to the experience of love. And that's why they think that that's why it's helpful to come up with more words for different kinds of love as opposed to just one love, because then you can be more accurate and you can point to unique manifestations of love. And one of them being friendship. According to Lewis, now we have to remember when we're talking about definitions is that very often we're talking about the same thing, but we're using different words, or we're using the same words, but we're actually describing a different reality. So very often disagreements are just about talking past each other and there's no real disagreement. But what Lewis reserves that name love, philia, for friendship with a capital F, is that form of love. So that form of appreciative and responsive commitment to the beloved's flourishing, that is characterized, the uniqueness comes from joint pursuits and joint passions. So in order to have and experience this form of love, you need to be interested in the same things, at least some of the same things. And so you may not have friendship between lovers, for example. You may not have friendship between parents and siblings, for example, or co-workers necessarily. Although very often friendship does arise in the context of work because you already have this common arena, this common interest. Lewis uses this metaphor of friends being shoulder to shoulder. They're looking in the same direction. as opposed to face as lovers would be. And
Mm.
so that's it. That's the key, the distinguishable characteristic that they think separates friendship from other forms of love. And it also explains, in their view, why those lonely people who just want to make friends and find friends never make them and end up lonely, because they would say that you ought to want something above and beyond friendship, around which then the love of friendship can become about. But if you're not passionate, if you're not interested in anything, so you can't share that love of philia with anyone else.
Right. That's really interesting. Because in terms of like friendship, oftentimes I hear the opposite of what Lewis is describing here. Is this camaraderie that's based on just the choice of being side by side, even in the midst of, or when you do have widely different interests. So how does that fit into this picture then? If I have friends who don't share my interests.
It fits in very well. And I think the key is what I said earlier, is that we're talking about different things. And Lewis uses the word camaraderie, in fact. He distinguishes what he calls friendship from camaraderie. And he says camaraderie is awesome, but it's not friendship. And there's a difference between the two. So you can have camaraderie with a lot of people, and it brings value and joy to your life. But it's not friendship in their view, because it's lacking something. It doesn't mean that it's not a form of love or it's not valuable, but it's just a different thing. Similarly, you can have a lot of affection for folks. Affection is one of the four loves that Lewis describes and distinguishes, and he says it's primarily a love between parents and children or siblings, but it can actually be a love that characterizes almost any relationship if the key to this love is familiarity. So familiarity, as the person is very familiar to you, you've spent time together in some context, and that sort of relationship breeds its own form of emotion and affection, what he calls affection. And that explains things like why the example that Lewis uses is how a child can love with affection a gardener, a familiar gardener. You have to think back in England in the 1940s and 50s, that they've seen all their lives, and they know, even if the gardener has never really paid any special attention, but the child still trusts that, and yet the child can shirk back from this friendly visitor who's been trying to make every effort to befriend the child. And we see this empirically happen all the time. Well, Lewis explains it in terms of familiarity or lack of. So what does that sound like? Does that answer that question, Johanna, about camaraderie that isn't about shared interests?
Yeah, I think so. Affection seems to fit the bill better, especially if there have been lifelong friendships, and throughout the course of one's life, it is only natural that one's, interests might diverge and you don't really share those anymore that you might have shared when you were kids, for example. But that there is that level of affection and even commitment to the relationship, even when you clearly can see that, okay, we've in some ways perhaps grown apart.
This happens very often when folks graduate from middle school or high school or university. Some of the people we consider friends are more like camaraderie. and you love them, you like them, but over time, there'll be one or two or three who stick with you longer, and more often than not, there's something more than just this shared camaraderie and shared space, that the context that forced you together. But beyond that, you've found that you ask the same questions and you have the same interest or passions.
Yeah, exactly. The reason why we laughed about graduation is because I'm just about to graduate. So that's the context just for my listeners. Anyway, based on the four loves, I think you said in an interview that Lewis had said that previously when men and women couldn't work side by side, Philia could not develop. So there were, women were not working, or they were not able to work or engage in academia. So that was the reason why Philia could not develop. But now that things were changing, even during their time, obviously now for us is very much different. Real friendships can develop. And this leads us to the topic of friendship between the sexes. This is actually an interesting one, because in my sphere, this little bubble of femininity, which is on the internet, on Instagram, on the podcasting world, is its own world, you could say. And there are sort of subsections within that whole sphere. And some of the more traditional, which I value very much, but I think I'm a combination of all of them. So in some of the more traditional views on womanhood, femininity, and usually based on like focus on homemaking and on staying at home and cultivating femininity at home, there is an emphasis that I've seen, or arguments flowing about, that men and women cannot be friends, even today. So what is your take on this? Because I know that my listeners are sometimes wondering themselves, what is the context within which we can, or can we, create friendships between the sexes? Is it problematic? Is it possible? Is it recommendable? And what does Lewis say about this?
Well, it sounds like there could be two reasons why men and women can't be friends in your context. One is that you've got these more traditional homemakers. If it is true that men and women don't work alongside each other and partake in the same pursuits and interests, then Lewis would say it's very unlikely that men and women will become friends. Not that they can't, but just that they will not, because the so-called matrix from which this friendship can arise is missing.
Yeah.
And this is the historical theory that Lewis proposes in The Four Loves to explain something that's pretty much an empirical fact, is that this is a recent phenomena, this friendship between men and women, where in societies and eras and even religions where work and home are pretty gendered, Lewis would argue that such friendships didn't arise because they couldn't arise, not because there's something unnatural about it, but because the context would not permit it to happen. And so you have in history, you have these isolated cases of friendship between women and men that happen in monastic circles. So you have nuns writing to monks, and it's a genuine friendship because they're reading the same books, they're discussing intellectual and theological matters. So they have this glue that can form philia, according to Lewis.
Right.
Now he says, and this is why I think they're so pioneering, that they were trailblazers. They belong to this first generation, more or less first generation, that saw men and women working side by side. And according to Lewis, at least, friendship between the sexes in his time was already very common. It was a very, very common. He himself preferred the change. He was happy that this was taking place in his own field, which was the academy. Women had recently, within a generation, been allowed to graduate from university and become professors, and valuable. And he thought it's not only common and possible, but increasingly common and valuable. It's also valuable in very interesting ways. He thought that this friendship between the sexes can enrich your own eros and can enrich your own romantic relationships. And he had firsthand experience of that when quite late in life, he first befriended and then married this American poet, Joy Davidman. And Lewis said that nothing so enriches what Eros as this discovery that your significant other can enter into deep friendships with the friends you already had. And so he was observing how Joy was able to befriend his brother and befriend some of the Inklings and other friends. And the net result of that was just an increase in Eros itself. So not only that friendship between the sexes doesn't threaten Eros, but on the contrary, it can augment it in beautiful ways. So that's the first reason I think some people believe that friendship between the sexes can't happen. But I suspect that very often it's the other reason, which is that that Eros will eventually creep in, one-sided or reciprocal Eros, and then destroy that friendship, or turn that friendship into Eros. It doesn't have to be a negative thing, but it becomes a negative thing, obviously, if you're already engaged. I mean, if you're already in a relationship, if you have prior commitments and external Eros infiltrates and ruins it and mars it. And Lewis and Tolkien were very aware of this. They obviously saw that friendship can turn into Eros. I mean, it happened to themselves. It happened to Lewis. So they weren't naive about it, but they never, as far as I've understood, they never took the so-called Billy Graham route. Those of you who know Billy Graham, the evangelist, was pretty famous for many, many laudable merits and accomplishments. But one is that he was so committed to his wife, and he was so afraid of ruining his relationship, like so many pastors and TV evangelists had done, that he thought that in order to protect this, he's never going to cultivate intimate friendship with the opposite sex unless there's another male present, or a female, like a third party. So this means not going into the same elevator. This means not going into the same car if it's just the two of you. But also to not give this vulture media any excuse for rumors or anything. He wanted to honor his marriage in this way. I'm not sure Tolkien and Lewis would think this was a good strategy to protect your marriage, because you're kind of outsourcing responsibility to something external. So instead of cultivating the virtues within you that would protect the relationship, you're kind of just saying no to something that is the threat. And so you're cutting yourself from half of the world's population in a significant respect, not allowing friendship to develop. between you and possibly other forms of love as well.
That rule
So it's a
also
drastic
has,
measure.
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I'm sorry, there's a bit of delay, so now it can happen that we
Are we back?
talk at the same time. Just about the Graham rule, the Billy Graham rule, is that while yes, I believe that the media portion of it was understandable very much, but the effect of that rule is also that it's othering women. Like, if I imagine myself in that position where someone is like, I'm not going into the elevator with you, that has a weird effect on me. That would be really odd.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. It's othering women and it's othering men. If you're a woman who ascribes to this pretty pessimistic understanding, I'd say I've used sometimes an analogy to try and understand and maybe expose what I think is wrong with it. And it's so the basic idea is that so you may have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, for example, that you really can't control alcohol. And so you say no to alcohol. Okay, there's something wrong with you, seriously, if you do that. And it may be something that you ought to do just because of whatever reasons. You just cannot touch alcohol. But with human relationships, I think it's a bit different. Like you should really work on yourself because of how it's not a cocktail. You're talking about a human person there, not a pint of beer. This is a real human person that is the quote unquote evil or the tempter here. But imagine if your temptation or your, to use theological language, the temptation to sin, the problem isn't alcoholism or lust, like I'm lusting women so I'm not going to hang out with them, but your problem is racism. Okay, so say you're a white person and a dark skin it's just like somehow inspires negative feelings and thoughts in you for whatever upbringing. You can't help it. It's awful, and it's automatic. And you think, well, what am I going to do about this? How do I counter and conquer this? This is intolerable. I know that this person is a wonderful being that I should love and trust and respect. Oh, I know I'm never going to hang out with them. I'm never gonna, if there's a black person, I'll never be in the same elevator with them or in the same car if it's unless there's another white person with me there. What do you think, Johan? Does this sound like very healthy?
It sounds like a legit plan. Yeah, that's not gonna fix it.
No, that's not gonna fix it. It'll exacerbate it. So yeah, back to C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. They weren't naive, but I don't see any evidence of them going adopting such drastic othering measures.
So when we think about because I think this is the concern that women have, and it's also something that I've had to learn from experience, that there is that potential of something else, being created in a relationship that should only be friendship or should be clearly within boundaries. So how do we cultivate that virtue that you mentioned, in your view? How do we create that internal scaffolding so that we can be a whole person with another whole person and not other them, or not create external rules that sort of, as you said, externalize our own responsibility and accountability? What do you think?
Well, the easy answer for men is stop watching porn.
Sure.
Maybe for many women too, but you can tell. I mean, many women can see when they look at a man and a man looks at them. I mean, sometimes they can sense that this guy watches too much porn. There's something in the look in the eye. I say this is an easy answer, but I think it's a real epidemic,
It
and it
is an
would be
epidemic,
very
sure.
helpful to cut out porn from your diet, because that is primarily what's causing you to look at and lust at people and treat them as just a stepping stone to a pleasure. And one of my favorite thinkers, Pope John Paul II, who was a philosopher before he became Pope, has said that the problem of pornography is not that it exposes too much, but that it doesn't show enough. It doesn't show the whole human person. The fig leaf that symbolically was covering the genitals has just been lifted to cover the face figuratively
right.
speaking. But I think that's so true, and it's beautifully put. It's very body positive and sexual, embraces human sexuality in its rightful context. But the virtue, how to cultivate virtue, and we should talk about virtues in the plural, I believe. Character in the singular, but virtues in the plural, because character is the totality, the combination of all your virtues and your vices combined. When we talk about someone who has strong character, what we mean is that they have like more virtues than vices, and lack of character then just means like more vices than virtues, or significant deficiencies in virtues that lead you, that somehow manifest themselves in very negative ways. Before we should talk about virtue and what they mean and why they're important. Lewis offers two love principles that I think are very valuable. I think they're true, and I think they're practically very valuable, even though he himself doesn't in his own life always apply them consistently. I still think he's right about them. The first love principle is that you can never love too much. That there is no such thing as loving too much. We say you can love something or someone too much, but when you look at the situation, you analyze it more closely, the opposite is always the truth, more accurate. That there was a deficiency in love, not an excess of love, but a deficiency of love. You didn't love them enough or in the right way. The love itself, the appreciative and responsive commitment to the other's flourishing, to the beloved's flourishing, you can never have too much appreciative and responsive commitment to the other's flourishing. Unless the only way you could have it too much is that you're investing too much time. So you're so committed to something that's lower in the hierarchy of your responsibilities than, say, I'm playing golf 8 hours a day. Okay. I'm appreciatively and responsively committing to this lovely hobby of mine. There's nothing wrong with it, except in proportion to higher responsibilities. If the time investment and the commitment is stealing from rightful, more important priorities, then it becomes a problem. But what you do then is that you kind of like, so this is the first love principle, is that you can't love too much. You can only love too much in proportion. And so that's the first principle. And the second one follows directly from it, which is that when you notice a rivalry in your relationships and your loves, when you notice them in disorder, when you put second things first instead of second things second, and so on, the solution to this is never to love less, but always to love more. The solution is always to love more, to purify your love, never to love less. To use an example, so if I love my children, I have 3 small children, Johanna, and I absolutely adore them. But if I love them at the expense, I love them this much, at the expense of loving my wife, when it actually should be like this, for everyone's flourishing. Even the children will flourish when I love their mother more. Well, when that happens, so I'm loving my children like this a bit more than my wife. The solution isn't to start loving my children less, so that now that we're even, but the solution is to love my wife even more. Perhaps there's some sort of time component that I need to adjust in my time spent with the children or something, but it's not like I'm loving them less. I'm actually purifying my loves, putting them in order. And so that's a long way to answer your original question about what do I do if I'm in a committed relationship and I'm cultivating these friendships with people who might, these relationships might become an occasion for Eros to creep in. Like, what do I do? Well, if it's genuine, if it's a genuine friendship and a love, you purify it. You purify it. You love your significant other better. You prioritize them. But you don't necessarily have to discard the other person out of your life. That's very, very drastic. Sometimes you have to, because sometimes it is an unlawful relationship, and the point isn't really to be completely transparent, but there's already this budding adultery or unfaithfulness. Sometimes some relationships need to be cut for sure, but very often no, not at all. And so that I would apply these 2 love principles to these situations. First of all, your problem is not that you love them too much, but if there's a problem, if that relationship has caused a problem, your love for them is deficient. It's not pure in some way, it's lacking. And second of all, the solution to any given situation is more love. And from this, we could move on to individual virtues and what effect they have in human relationships and why they are absolutely crucial.
Yes, let's go into those. So, what are the main virtues? How many are there?
Countless. We've lost the vocabulary of virtue in many, many languages. Finnish, one of my paternal language for sure, but also English. But we need some resurrecting here. First of all, the whole concept of virtue is often misunderstood as being some sort of vague value or something good, maybe something edible, as somebody said once. But the best way to think of virtue is that they're muscles. They're quote unquote spiritual muscles, analogous to our physical muscles. And why this is helpful is that you have many of them, just like you have many muscles, and they're good human habits or strengths that become part of your character, or you can acquire them through habituation by repeatedly training them. They become part of you, and they help you live out a fuller life and to pursue goodness and truth and beauty. So wisdom, courage, fidelity, temperance, patience, perseverance, faithfulness, loyalty. The list goes on. There are countless of them, and what they do is that they all serve love. They all serve love. So in order to be a good lover, to be able to appreciatively and responsively commit to the beloved's flourishing, whether the beloved is a romantic partner or God or yourself or your friend or an animal or your country or whatnot, you need all of these virtues, all of them. Thomas Aquinas says that they grow like fingers on the hand. They grow or wither together. And what he means by that is that it's hard to be, for example, a just person, so to be able to be fair in your dealings, unless you're also a courageous person. Because there will come situations where if you don't have that courage, you will not be able to do the fair and just thing, because sometimes doing the fair and just thing is risky. And so only the person who has developed the virtue of courage is able to do that. And the same with all the virtues. All of the virtues require one another in order to be fully virtuous. But the lover, the one who is serious about love, has to be serious about character and about virtues, because you cannot appreciatively and responsibly commit to a beloved's flourishing unless you have these virtues. Or I put it this way: insofar as you have these virtues, you can be a lover. It's a spectrum. Imagine being a perfect spouse, for example, except you lack just one virtue, just one out of the several dozens of virtues: faithfulness. Just one virtue, and you've seriously marred and dented your ability to love. Or say you're a great friend, except you're not quite loyal. Like, how great are you? Or that you love your great teacher who loves his or her students or pupils, except you're not very wise. So you lack the virtue that understands reality, wisdom, and sets good goals and finds the ways to achieve these goals, which is a crucial virtue for teachers, but it's also a crucial virtue for lovers, because starting from gift giving, like, what gift should I give this person? Only a wise person who studied the other person will know that. So just to mention like a little taste of different virtues, how crucial and important, in my view, they are for love. And you can train them just like you train muscles at a gym or any kind of sport, through repetition and practicing, taking very baby steps in these difficult areas, or areas that are difficult for you, whether it is courage or wisdom or patience or anything, and just train them, just like you would train a muscle.
Yeah, exactly. It's so good. I don't think I have talked about virtues on this podcast, certainly from different perspectives, from a more self-development, self-growth perspective. But virtues being the, I don't know, older, or, has a long tradition in different literature, different cultures, that just sort of ties it all in. And I believe, actually, that many of the sort of self-development gurus, what they try to impart, at least partly, is virtues. But
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. They talk about atomic habits.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the 7 habits of highly effective people. And absolutely, yeah, they're trying to bring back this vocabulary that we've lost, because as societies, we like rules, and we've started to talk about do this or don't do that, but we've forgotten that rules are secondary, and the person with virtue doesn't really need rules as much. It doesn't mean that the person who's virtuous can break the rules, but will know instinctively, habitually, what to do in every given moment, even if not aided by rules or laws or decrees
Yeah, exactly. So diving into the 3 types of love, or actually, well, in case of C.S. Lewis, there are 4 types of love, 4 loves. But generally, I think that most of my listeners are familiar with the 3 types of love that we talk about, especially in a biblical context: agape,
Hmm.
philia, and eros. So how do we distinguish agape from, let's say, philia?
This is a huge question, Johanna, and again, just a reminder of how we use the same words to mean different things. So when Lewis uses the word charity, it's an old English translation of the Latin caritas, which is just a Latin translation of the Greek agape. He means slightly different from what Christians often are taught about agape. In the Christian popular imagination, when we think of agape, we somehow think of an unselfish love, as opposed to a selfish love. And
Right.
I think this is, I think, a bit silly.
Okay.
It's not like human love is terribly selfish. At least Lewis doesn't believe that. So he's a bit more nuanced in his treatment of agape. And that's why he doesn't use that word agape in his book, but he goes for charity, because he wants to bypass whatever the popular imagination says agape is at the time. So instead of agape being this divine love that is poured down from heaven to somehow replace our earthly or our human or our natural loves, which
Yeah.
was the popular understanding at the time, he thinks
I think still
agape
is.
still is, absolutely. You see it in popular sermons, you see it in books, in
Yes.
conversations.
Yes.
But then this brings up this idea that there's some sort of Christian love as opposed to a non-Christian love. And I'm not sure Lewis buys that. So the idea is that Jesus introduces this sort of new love that was foreign to the world. But I don't think that that's very tenable, that's true. Even his example of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is specifically the non-Jew, the non-Christian. And in that example, the Good Samaritan is the one who loves best. So obviously, this greater love, this wonderful love, is attainable outside of the church, outside of Christian circles. And so, but what's crucial, what's novel and revolutionary about love in the New Testament is that this love, this appreciative and responsive commitment to the beloved's flourishing, this love is also how God loves us. That's crazy. So instead of God being somehow indifferent or even hostile to us, God is committed to our flourishing. And in our case, our flourishing required that he go the whole 9 yards, that he gives his life for us. But this aspect of self-sacrificial love is universal. Like mothers have done it all the time. Soldiers have loved with agape, giving their life. Policemen have done it. Firefighters have done it. So I don't think that's a novelty, as if this sort of love, self-sacrificing love, didn't exist. So in my view, and many people disagree with this view, what's novel is that God also loves us with this same love, and that Jesus reminds us to expand the scope of our beloveds, whom we consider beloveds, so to include enemies, although enemy love wasn't a foreign thing in Judaism either. St. Paul is quoting the Old Testament when he talks about feeding your enemy. but just expand this. So show this appreciative and responsive love to more and more and more people, not just your family or your close. But the love itself stays the same. The scope is expanded. The love itself is still the same love. It's not like the love somehow changed. Okay, so that's a long introduction to Lewis and charity. In the four loves, charity is closer to character than this sort of supernatural love in my reading. When you look at what affection and friendship and Eros, what they need in order to remain sweet, to use his figurative metaphorical language, they need justice, they need common sense, they need faithfulness and self-denial, all these beautiful virtues that we were talking about, which together make one's character. So I think that's basically what charity means. Lewis also does believe that God can help and the Holy Spirit can help, of course, and that at least in theory, Christians have an advantage because they're conscious of the ideal. They're constantly reminded of the ideal of love, and they're commanded to love. So they have this constant reminder to love. And they have these tools like prayer and scripture and the sacraments that can help them remain motivated in love and fill out their blind spots, whatever blind spots they may have, in theory at least. But in practice, this is not always the case, as we all know.
Right, exactly. And when go ahead.
I was going to say that, just personally speaking, one source of added or supercharged motivation for loving better, again, not loving with a different kind of love, it's always the same love, appreciative and responsive commitment to the beloved's flourishing. That's always love. But to succeeding in that love better than before are experiences of being forgiven. So the scripture speaks of that woman who was forgiven much, and as a result, she was pouring her love out to Jesus. And we've all maybe experienced, had small experiences of this when we've been forgiven little evil deeds we've done as a child or a teenager or even as an adult. If we have genuine contrition and we genuinely feel bad about it and we regret it and somebody forgives us, it's so liberating, and it does have this psychological effect or spiritual effect on us that we want to be better, that we like, now I want to live up to the worth, now I want to be worthy to that mercy that was shown me. And so you're again motivated to love better. But just imagine that, if we can imagine that small, if this taste of this forgiveness and the power of forgiveness, imagine what a metaphysical, holistic forgiveness might do to someone when a person is not forgiven an individual sin, but forgiven for being a sinner, period. And people talk about conversion and metanoia, change of heart. That might be a very, very powerful experience and a source of new motivation and a recharged energy to love better in the future.
Yeah, exactly. So moving on to Eros, how does Lewis, or how would you describe Eros?
Eros is an awesome love. And again, many people mean different things by it. Lewis means something very specific. So Plato means an aspiring love, a love that is directed to a beautiful or a good object. Christian theologians, Lutheran theologians, by Eros, they mean just human love, and they think Eros is egocentric. There's nothing romantic or sexual about it. It just means human love. Lewis reserves the word Eros for the experience of being in love or romance, this enthrallment in a person. And he distinguishes it from Venus, which is the symbol for sexual love, so physical sexual love. And he said you can have one without the other. You can have Venus without Eros, and you can have Eros without Venus. But sometimes they go together. And Eros wants a person primarily, not a body, not a pleasure, but what is enthralled by a person. And so it's appreciative, and it's responsive, and it's proactive. It's committed to the beloved's flourishing, just like the other loves are. But it has this unique flavor, this unique characteristic of just being so in love with someone, marveling at their existence, even if they weren't for you. And this is a typical in the beginning of romantic relationships, specifically. But you can have Eros for anyone. God can have Eros for us. We can have Eros for God. Again, just Eros doesn't have to mean Venus.
Yeah. I think that's a really good distinction, and I love that Lewis is talking about it. Now I really have to read that book. I mentioned in the beginning that when we started before we started recording that I do have the Four Loves on my shelf, looking down on me for not picking it up. But I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it.
Hey, the book has an interesting prehistory. Before it was a book, Johanna, it was a series of radio talks. An American Episcopalian TV radio foundation asked Lewis to give a series of talks on his chosen subject. And he immediately wrote back and said, yes, I'd be happy to do it. And I've wanted to do something about the Four Loves. And they liked the idea. So the representative flies to London from the US to record this series of talks and goes back. But it was canceled before cancel culture existed, because the board of bishops, when they listened to the recordings, they said, we can't air this nationwide. This has to be limited to a particular small region instead of the whole nation. And I felt to the representative to explain to Lewis that, unfortunately, Professor Lewis, in your chapter on Eros, you talked about sex. And Lewis thought that's like, how could the country that produced the most pornography in the world already in the 50s not stomach a Christian discussion on sex? So he wrote back to say that how am I supposed to talk about Eros and leave it out? But he does make a distinction, and he thinks the distinction is very important. What Eros, as opposed to Venus, what Eros teaches, in Lewis's view, teaches lovers. So he's doing two things in this book. On one hand, he's defending the human loves against the ones who want to disparage them, many of them Christian, who want to disparage human love and contrast human loves to negatively to what they thought is a more better agape Christian love. So he's defending the natural loves, but he's also warning lovers not to treat natural loves as gods, especially the emotion of love as a god, in a way, your highest authority that you obey. Eros in particular is susceptible to this. It can easily usurp, like unlawfully steal the loyalty to God, and it can compel you to do evil things. The feeling of in-loveness is such a powerful emotion that it can lead to atrocities, and you might leave your lover because you have a mistress, or you may neglect your children, or betray your friend because you're in love with her husband, or something like that. So God is love, but love is not God, is a running theme in the four loves. But what Eros does, Eros's value, Eros's contribution to a fuller understanding of the idea of love in Lewis's view, is that Eros, quite naturally, but it can't keep its promise. It promises this lifelong happiness, and it does something remarkable, seemingly on its own for a while, but on its own it will die unless it's supported by character. Eventually it will wither and die. But it teaches you, it gives you an experience of having planted another's interests, another's well-being in the very center of your own being, where sacrifices would become easy. Like no one is able to make so towering sacrifices as easily as a person who is in love is. Yeah, like you are worth it. I am going to spend, I'm going to invest, I'm going to praise. These things don't matter. Like I can do them later. You are amazing. How great that you exist. And that, Lewis says, is good. That's a good thing. And it's a taste of just a beautiful love. But again, it's a natural love, and it's not so self-sustaining. It won't remain sweet. And it's like a beautiful garden that spontaneously erupts in full bloom, and for a while seems to be going on its own steam. But it will turn into a jungle unless there's a gardener, and unless somebody takes care of that garden.
Right. Yes, exactly. I'm really happy that Lewis has a more nuanced view on that. As I mentioned in some of the notes, that I have a personal grievance with primarily Christian way of discussing Eros, at least the way I've been taught Eros, or the way I've heard it being talked about. And it has been, as per how you described it, the Venus kind of love. Like that's solely what I've heard about being talked about when even mentioning the word Eros. And my mind sort of blew open when I was actually reading a book that is not Christian, or is not based on Christianity, but is based on Jewish mysticism. It's called A Return to Eros, and it's a really great book, a long one, and quite academic in its, or philosophic in its tone, but really a great one. I didn't take everything as they are. I do digest everything critically, but still it opened my eyes to see how my own view of Eros in the past was very, very limited. And then I saw that that is the prevalent way of talking about Eros that I still come across, different media, whether it's a sermon, whether it's on Instagram, when I'm talking to my lovely ladies, my listeners, my clients, that's still what people refer to. So what is your view on this? Do you see this still being something that people sort of see it as this very reductionistic way, or a reductionistic version of Eros? It's just this one corner that sex is Eros, but rather it should be that sex is part of Eros, but it doesn't exhaust it.
Yeah, this is the fundamental distinction that Lewis introduces in his concept. So definitely, I laud you, Johanna, and I encourage you to read it.
Yes, I really need
It
to.
sounds like you'll enjoy it. I haven't heard of Return to Eros, so I made a note of that myself. What's ironic is that we've all heard of this idea of platonic love,
Mm-hmm.
and what it has come to mean is friendship. When we say, are you going? No, it's just platonic. What does that mean? Well, it means that there's no sex involved,
Mm-hmm.
right? What's the word Plato uses for his love? Eros. So it's erotic. It's erotic in his view. It doesn't have to be sexual, but it's still erotic. So that's an irony, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
But Plato, of course, like he had a prejudice against the body and the material, and his idea of love that develops because it becomes more spiritual. It's leaving the particulars behind, and it's leaving the material world behind. So that you can't very easily square that with a Christian conception of love that takes created world and embodies very seriously. Yeah, you as a Finn know that in Finland, Valentine's Day is called Friendship Day,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which is I think is beautiful and something worth trying to protect. And it's one way to decentralize Eros from our imagination. Sorry, decentralize sex from
Mm.
our imagination, because that's what we think Eros is. It's about sex, but it's also, and it's kind of comes full circle back to friendship. It's also a nice reminder of the value of friendship. Like you can celebrate Eros any given Saturday night. How many days do you have devoted to friendship? So I really hope, as a half Finn, that Finns continue protecting this day against the infiltration of Valentine's Day culture.
Right. Let me just see. Yes, okay. We're slowly running out of time. Are you in a hurry to your next engagement?
I've got 15 minutes. Yeah.
15 minutes. Okay, good. Right. So moving on to, I want really briefly us to go to the 30 theses of love. What's that all about? I know that on your website, your Finnish website, they are in Finnish, but why, like, what inspired you to write these? Is this something that you feel like we need to learn about? People need to be re-educated on love.
Absolutely. So I have 30, actually 29, but the 30th thesis invites you to come up with your own thesis. But well, let's say 30 theses on love that I posted in Finnish. And some of them are pretty provocative, but I think the number is pretty random. There's no symbolic significance to 30, unfortunately. I could come up with a cool story, but I won't. But I think they're very helpful. It's taken time for me to learn them and to really buy into them. But for example, this one of the theses, I think the thesis number 9 is that the capital O, the one does not exist. So your soulmate does, in a way, does not exist.
Yeah.
We're all wrong for each other. We're all wrong for each other. I think this is very valuable to hear and to remember, that you cannot outsource responsibility in success in relationships to finding your soulmate or finding that one, because there is no such thing. Everyone's wrong. They're wrong because they're fallible, weak, incomplete human beings just like you. They will hurt you, you will hurt them. They come to the relationship wounded. There will be new wounds. Your context will pose serious challenges on both of you that will test your personalities and your character. Everyone's wrong, but some are less wrong than others. So maybe that's a more modest way of looking at it. So if you believe in a soulmate or the one, you're probably lonely and you're going to be disillusioned in life and hurt. Everyone's wrong. Tolkien wrote to his son who was in love. He was wounded in the Second World War, and he was in love with his nurse. And after just 3 weeks, they wanted to get married. And Tolkien wrote to his son. Many people have interpreted him to try to talk his son out of marrying, but I don't think that's happening. I think he's telling his son that if you are going to marry, this is it. Like, you are committed to this woman. When the feelings pass, that is not an excuse to discard and abandon her. Like, you are committed. Your soulmate is the person with whom you happen to be married.
Yeah.
Sounds very unsexy and unromantic, but your soulmate is the person with whom you happen to be married. You create that soulmate with someone. So anyway, that's one of the 30 theses, and the others are like it, in that I'm hoping to provoke people to rethink their views on love.
Exactly. And on that point, it's something that I've been saying on this podcast as well. The way I say it is that the one is the one you choose. Period.
Sorry, Johanna, you just cut out there for 10 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, so I was in agreement with what you were saying, that I'm also been saying on this podcast that the one is the one you choose. Period.
I love that. The one is the one you choose. Maybe I should update my thesis. That's better. That's well put.
Yes, I've certainly I see constantly the idea of a soulmate, and then in some like more new age spirituality, there is this concept of twin flames and whatnot. So it's definitely in some form or another, it's circulating all the time. And I'm not going to trying to convince someone that if they believe that they have met their soulmate, great. Please, now you've chosen this person, so you're going to stick with them, and that makes them your soulmate. But it is a dangerous concept when people experience the breakdown of Eros or the breakdown of desire, because they don't have a connection, first of all, connection to themselves and to the other person, and then they meet someone else and interpret the situation.
They finally meet their soulmate.
Yes, I've met my soulmate, and now you're having to make this decision. And as you said, the feeling of being in love is very powerful, and without the that character that we talked about, you can make a decision that is going to hurt a lot of people. And some people really get offended when I say that, because you should be free to do whatever you want and follow your heart. And I do talk about our connection with our heart, especially as feminine beings. It's an important thing that we are connected to our heart and our womb. But it is not the way we discern when we are faced with an emotional conflict in a situation like this. And it breaks my heart to see all of the stories of people who have left their spouses and perhaps left their children, and they're chasing an idea of whether it's a soulmate or a twin flame or whatever that term is. Yeah, well, I'm not going to go on a rant about that because I literally could, but that's all I want to say about it. The one is the one you choose, and you got to nurture and nourish that relationship for it to thrive. Before you go, any last words of advice, words of wisdom about the purpose of marriage, and your advice to a single woman who is looking to find a husband?
Oh, wow. You ended with a small talk question, did you?
Yeah, yes, it's a very short,
Very, very easy.
quickly answered.
What's the purpose of marriage? Advice to single women. Primarily, I think the purpose, this isn't very popular, but I think primarily the purpose of marriage is children, at least openness to children. Marriage as an institution provides the best venue for children. Now, not everybody can have children, and at some point you can't. At some point you won't be able to. So it's not the only purpose. Obviously, there are other purposes as well. Another secondary purpose for marriage is to provide, in my view, to provide a safe space for you to become who you're meant to be. A relationship that allows you, ideally, allows you to develop your personality and your talents in a safe place where you screw up today, well, let's try again tomorrow. That's fine. We're in here in the long run. So if you have the back door open when you enter marriage, I think you will use it eventually.
Yeah.
Only those who don't have a back door open will stay together, in my view. There are exceptions, but I think that seems to be a trend. So don't have B plans. How do you find a husband, a single woman? Oh goodness. So there is no average person. When we're talking about averages, statistical averages, nobody actually fits the mold. So just let's remember that. But so with this in mind, the average statistics say that if you want children, you're a woman and you want children, start early. Women play with higher stakes and you're more likely to lose. I think. Prioritize family over career. The world rings with the heartbreaking cries or sighs of women in their 40s who wanted to have children. The great majority of childless women are involuntarily childless, involuntarily. So I would say start early, prioritize family over your career. Remember, there is no soulmate. The soulmate is whom you choose. You may have unrealistic expectations too. A marriage, if you find the person who isn't perfect, but who is committed to character development, who understands that you can't use your temperament as an excuse, as a moral alibi for bad behavior, but realizes the responsibility that you have through your fostering or neglect of virtues, has a lot of potential, and together you can grow and in a safe relationship called marriage. So here are a few things I would say. Also, I would say you might have some other false understandings or ideas about love that are hindering your progress or making it less likely that you will succeed. So read C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves.
Yes. If you now haven't memorized the name of that book, you should write it down.
Or read Erich Fromm. He's a psychiatrist. Erich Fromm's The Art of Love, which is even shorter. The Art of Love is very well understood that love is a virtue and that it's trainable, that it needs the other virtues.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, maybe you have a 2020 vision of love, but maybe you don't. It's very good to stop and really think critically. What do I believe about love and what do I base it on?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So to wrap this up, Jason, please let us know where we can find you online.
Oh, well, you can find me on YouTube. I have some lectures and talks there in Finnish and in English. You can find all my love scholarship on academia.edu. I've posted most of it there for free. If you're a Finnish speaker, you can read my book, Perjantai-lahja, Esseitä rakkaudesta. So an essay collection on love, which came out a couple of years ago. You can, if you're interested in C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, you can Google studycslewis.com, where I offer Oxford-style tutorials on these subjects and many more.
Love that. Amazing. Thank you so much, Jason, for your time. I truly appreciate it. I don't take it for granted that you shared it with me.